Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight. This is the second in our spring lecture series in support of our multi-year programmatic initiative, the Civil War and Remaking America, as we're looking at the causes and coming of the Civil War and individuals on the eve of war. I'm Kelly Hancock, the Director of Programs here at the American Civil War Museum. And before we get started, I do have a few announcements. I hope everyone will plan on coming back here on May 30th for the last of our spring lectures as Dr. Barton Myers from Washington Lee University highlights General Winfield Scott. Someone who doesn't really get a lot of press, so I'm excited to hear what Dr. Myers has to say about him. Also, for those of you that did not get to get this members peek at the impending crisis exhibit tonight, mark your calendars to come back, because on April 27th, so this Saturday, the impending crisis exhibit will be open to the general public. And so plan on returning to see that exhibit. Now, if anyone is close to the Appomattox area or doesn't mind the nice drive out there, on May 9th at 6 p.m. we have a talk with Patrick O'Donnell on his new book, The Unvanquished, The Untold Story of Lincoln's Special Forces, the Manhunt for Mosby's Rangers, and the Shadow War that forged America's Special Operations. So plan on seeing us out in Appomattox. And then our virtual talk of the year, or the month, our virtual book talk is going to be on May 16th. It will feature Jim Downs' Maladies of Empire, How Colonialism, Slavery, and War Transformed Medicine. And this is May 16th at 6:30, and you can join us virtually for that program. I do want to say a special thank you to those of you who are members of the American Civil War Museum. Raise your hand if you're a member here tonight. We have a wonderful turnout of members, and we are thankful for the support that you give as you help us do the work of exploring, inspiring, and promoting the public's understanding of the Civil War, its causes, course, and consequences. And now, that's it for the announcements. So the reason that we're all here tonight is to hear from Dr. David Blight, and I'm greatly honored to introduce him. David W. Blight is Sterling Professor of History and Director of Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. He is the author or editor of a dozen books, including Frederick Douglass' Prophet of Freedom, American Oracle, The Civil War and the Civil Rights Era, Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, as well as annotated editions of Douglass's first two autobiographies. Blight has worked on Douglass much of his professional life and been awarded the Pulitzer Prize, the Bancroft Prize, the Abraham Lincoln Prize, and the Frederick Douglass Prize, among others. He has always been a teacher first. At the beginning of his career, he spent 7 years as a high school history teacher in his hometown of Flint, Michigan. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. David Blight.
This mic, right? Thank you, Kelly. Thank you all for coming tonight. I can't tell you what a thrill it is to be back here in person, in the flesh. I think I did one Zoom event with the American Civil War Center during COVID. I was some years ago, I think in the original years of the center, I was on the board. I think they got tired of me missing meetings. I realized they probably needed some people other than just historians on the board. Need them. But truly, it was amazing to see in those early years, this place evolved. In fact, I will never forget the grand opening here, the original opening, where I don't know, there were 6 of us historians or something, were asked to come up and pull the cords that unveiled something. I don't know what we unveiled. Something on the wall, I guess. It was just a brick wall. I don't know. And then all the years I've done research here, I won't go into all of that, but except to say that when I was doing my Civil War memory book back in the 90s, I came to use the Museum of the Confederacy thinking, a couple days, stayed a couple more days. Then my old friend John Koski said, "You're gonna stay longer?" "Yeah." "Well, come early, you can get in when I get in." Then I would come back and I'd spend the whole week here and more, staying at the Linden Road and spending all day in that frankly incredible collection of Confederate memorial material. In fact, nearly everything I know about the lost cause came from that museum. Okay, my subject tonight is going to be Frederick Douglass and democracy. I've given, countless talks on Douglass since my biography came out, whatever it is now, 5 years ago or something like that. But it's been just in the past year I've begun to take up this question of democracy, and I keep working on it because it's a word on everybody's lips. Everyone seems worried. We don't know. I mean, everyone is talking about it, writing about it, worrying about it. And sometimes those of us in the pundit class or the op-ed class or the whatever we are, academic class, don't know what mode to use. Do we use satire to talk about what's happening to American democracy? Sometimes. Do we use just irony, which was Frederick Douglass's favorite mode? Do we do Jeremiads, warnings of impending doom? Do we put you on the precipice of something and make you worry? Yeah, sometimes. Or do we just trot out a whole lot of social scientific data and show you trends in this and trends in that? And that's not bad either. I started looking at the Pew Research Center for some things I was writing. It's the first time I've ever looked up data on, public opinion. I just, hasn't always been my way of doing history. Or do we look to the cinema? All right, how many of you have seen Civil War? Oh my goodness, I've seen it. Yes, I have opinions. You can ask later if you want. I went to see it because I got a call from Lisa Laird at the New York Times. She said, "I got to talk to you about this film. Have you seen it yet?" "Well, my piece is due in 2 days." "Oh, thanks." It was a Thursday night. I said, "I'll go out to the multiplex." The place was packed. The film is packing them in. Or do we think about what's happening to our democracy through historical analogy? Do we pick our moment in time and say, well, this is not quite 1861 yet, but maybe it's 1854? That gets dangerous because historical analogies are never direct. They're never that instrumental. You can't just plug it in, put in your quarter, and you get your historical analogy that'll work perfectly. It doesn't work that way, but we think in them all the time, don't we? We think by analogy and metaphor. Or do we just go look for philosophical wisdom? Do you go and read some of the great thinkers about democracy, some of the great poets about democracy, some of the, our philosophers who have said so much to say about this difficult thing called democracy? What is democracy? Is it the closed, self-governing community of ancient Athens? Trouble with ancient Athens was, and it was an amazing experiment, wasn't it? But if you dare to break those social norms they had, you might end up like Socrates. because he broke them. Or is democracy essentially like the popular sovereignty that seemed to emerge and rule for at least a short while in revolutionary Paris in 1792 until they got out the guillotine? That didn't end well. It was short-lived. Or is it democracy? Do we think of democracy as that existed in the early US Republic? That fledgling new thing, that early experiment, this thing called the United States, that had a written constitution. It had fought a revolution that it was mostly proud of, although not everybody was. It was trying to establish traditions. It was brand new and tried to come up with some things they could call traditions, because, you know, if you do something twice, it's a tradition. Or do we think about it in terms of the great revolutions in Europe in 1848, the great Republican revolutions that hit almost every Western European country? Short-lived again. They were trying to overthrow monarchy, finally. They thought they had monarchy finally on the run. And they were going to create republics. And that was short-lived. Or is democracy more that which was imagined into the world by the European socialist parties of the late 19th century, which were modeled by the American progressive movement and eventually modeled by the creators of the New Deal? A whole new kind of thinking about what governments owe people and people owe governments. Is that how we think it? I mean, if you grew up with parents like me, I'm dating myself, my parents were World War II generation, and therefore the Great Depression generation. Everything about them. They were both deeply working class people, but every assumption they had in life was born of the Depression and World War II. My mother was actually a Roosevelt-loving Democrat, and my father was a Nixon-loving Republican farm boy, rural, rock-ribbed, Roosevelt-hating Republican. They canceled each other out. I didn't get it. My dad died when I was only 21. I never quite got to quiz him on all that. Or do you think of democracy as somehow the world born out of World War I, where all these empires and monarchies just, or almost all of them, were obliterated in a madness of violence the world had never imagined. And afterward, it allowed people to believe it had been a war to save democracy and a war to end all wars. And even Germany had a republic, the Weimar Republic, with elections. Do you think of democracy as that thing, the New Deal, which really reinvented American ideas about government and created a new kind of social contract? Or do you think about democracy as that which you hate about the New Deal? Or do you think about democracy as that emerged in the world after the greatest catastrophe in human history, the Second World War? When the world for the first time had an actual definition of human rights. 1948, created something called the United Nations. It was trying to allow itself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, out of Armageddon, humankind could start over, create spreading democracy. Then there was that Soviet Union, and they got in the way. I don't know. You know, everybody's got their take now in democracy. When I'm pressed, I go to Walt Whitman. My students always kind of laugh at me because I quote Whitman a lot in my lecture course. You know, there he goes again, quoting some poem. Could you just give us one verse today? Oh, democracy, for you, I am trilling my song. That's in his poem called Oh, Democracy. The continent indissoluble with lifelong comrades. You could, if you read enough Whitman, or you just dip into Whitman once in a while, you can get inspired and happy. At least for a while. Democracy is so much harder than autocracy, isn't it? So much harder. It desperately needs rule of law to work. It needs rules, constitutions if you can create them, keep them. One of the most democratic poems ever imagined was Whitman's 51-page Song of Myself. Don't worry. You just go dip in for an hour into Song of Myself. Just dip around in it. You want to feel better or feel at least inspired? He talks about primeval urges that are possible in us to reach some kind of complete democracy. And his complete democracy is relationships between people. And Whitman's ultimate definition of democracy proves how hard it is. He defined it as accepting nothing which all cannot have. Oh dear. Go make that work. Like tomorrow. There was the great Virginian. I am in Virginia, aren't I? John Randolph, who once said, I love liberty, but I hate democracy. We don't love our liberty, my liberty. Democracy means you gotta cut that up somehow. You gotta share it. You gotta figure out a way to negotiate it. That's what's so hard about it. Now, Douglass. Some of you have read my biography on Frederick Douglass. Those of you who haven't, plan a few weekends. It's a long book. Lots of weekends. I had one guy once tell me, you messed up my NFL watching. Sorry. You don't have to read on Sunday. You know, skip the 4 o'clock game. I want to do 2 things about Douglass with you tonight. Douglass is perhaps all of you know now. He's a slave born out on the eastern shore of Maryland. He had no right at all to believe he could ever become some kind of world-class prose poet of American democracy, which is what he became. He wasn't born that way. He didn't just come out and say, I'm going to be the prose poet of America. No, he had to work at it, learn, borrow. Douglass, when young and even when old, was like a sponge. He never had a day in his life in a school, ever. And maybe you've known people like this. They don't have much formal education, but God, are they curious? And they can fix your plumbing or your computer. They probably had some schooling if they can fix your computer. But Douglass, when he met you, would figure out what he can learn from you. What do you got? What do you got? And actually, because he was so sensitive about trusting people, even as he got older, once he might have learned what you have to offer, he'd pass you by. He wasn't that good at friendships. I mean, he had more to learn. So I'm going over there with him now. There's something very democratic in that too, isn't there? the world's always loved that about Lincoln, that Lincoln had so little formal education, and yet he became Lincoln. It turns out Douglass and Lincoln actually read some of the same common books when they were young. They really did. Not the same list. You know, Lincoln didn't give Douglass his list. But when Douglass escapes from slavery, he's not fully formed. He's not what he's going to become. But what he is a creature of words. Right away. First, it's oratorical language. He did not come out of slavery at age 20. And when he ends up on the public lecture circuit at age 23, 4, and 5, he was an orator. He wasn't a writer yet. It took a lot longer. We understand this, don't we? It took a lot longer for him to master writing, but oh my God, when he did. He had help. He had friends who helped him. He had editors who helped him. He never did become a good speller. But he had a rage in him. If you've read my book, you've encountered this. He experienced about every wretched, dreadful treatment that a slave could experience. We could say even in Maryland, but in Maryland. We wouldn't even know about him if he hadn't been transferred from the Eastern Shore in rural slavery and agricultural slavery to Baltimore. He spent 11 of his 20 years as a slave out on the Eastern Shore and 9 of them in Baltimore. He became an urban slave around a somewhat cosmopolitan environment. In fact, an environment with far more free blacks than there were slaves in Baltimore. And there he was in one of the greatest harbors in North America. He saw the world coming into Baltimore Harbor and the world going out. He learned maritime skills, became a caulker, among other things. He went to 4 different churches. He even names the ministers and ranks them, you know. People do with their churches today. The second minister we had, he was lousy. I like the third one better. He even got involved in a debating society. He found out what every kid wants to find out. The one thing he was good at. And the one thing that Frederick Bailey, who will soon rename himself Douglass, was good at was language. First spoken. Words. He was thrilled by words. Thrilled by what he could read now. But he came out of slavery with a rage in him that had to find some outlet. And I've always argued, all the writing I've done about Frederick Douglass, that he had this advantage that eventually he developed such skill with language so he could process that rage. If you've got rage in you, it's going to get out. But if you don't have any other outlet, it's probably going to get out in some kind of violence. And you may not live through it. In his early oratorical life, from 1841 into the middle of the 1840s, he goes to England in 1845 to 47, 19 months, a total flowering in his life. Especially while he was in England, and I'm just going to use maybe a couple examples of this, although I went through, I have this new edition of Douglass's speeches and writings out from the Library of America. I was just going through today. I just went through the 1840s looking up all of his uses of the term democracy. It's all over the place. But you know how he uses it? Irony. Bitter irony. He does it. He almost never uses the term democracy except to show how the United States doesn't have it because of slavery. And when he got to England, of course, being the great ironist that he is, he says, you know, I have a lot more freedom here under a monarchy than I ever have at home under the American democracy. And he just keeps using that argument. Oh, at one point he calls American democracy a bastard democracy. And over with his British audiences. And if you want just one example, last major speech he makes in England. It's called his farewell address. He gave it at a huge tavern in a packed room in London in March of 1847. It's a long speech. We have the full text of it. It's amazing. But it's Douglass on the cusp of going home to America, and he's deeply ambivalent about it. Because in England, he has made countless friends. In the Irish, Scottish, and British anti-slavery communities, they have just adopted him. In fact, up in Scotland, they loved him so much, they wrote poems about him and songs about him. He'd walk into little Scottish towns and there'd be a little children's choir singing a song about him. I mean, he could hardly believe what was happening to him in monarchical England. And he talks about going back to an America that he hates. He used the term hate. And there's that one incredible passage where he says, I think of the valleys and the hills and the beautiful green landscapes of America, many of which I've seen, he says, but I can only think of it with unutterable loathing. Now, and then it can get worse. If you've ever read his greatest speech, the 4th of July speech, 1852, the rhetorical masterpiece of American reform literature. That speech is full of such uses of irony. It's actually, the speech is, I could just talk about the speech for the rest of our time, but I won't. It's Douglass saying in that speech, okay, this is 4th of July, right? It's your 4th of July, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. And on it goes. You, our, me, I, you. And there's this passage. Let it be thundered around the world that in tyrant-killing, king-hating, people-loving, democratic, Christian America, the scars of justice are, the seats of justice are filled with judges who hold their offices under an open and palpable bribe and are bound in deciding in the case of a man's liberty to hear only his accusers. He's referring there to the Fugitive Slave Act. That speech is the most brilliant analysis of American hypocrisy over slavery anyone ever crafted. And what's at stake there? You have a democracy, but no, you don't. But then, jump ahead with it. It's the same person. It's some years later to the most hopeful speech Douglass ever crafted. And I just want to refer to parts of it briefly and then ask, how could this be the same person? What happened? The speech is called The Composite Nation. It's not one of his most famous speeches, but it's one of the most important. I actually wrote an essay about it in the Atlantic, I don't know, some years back. If you want a real analysis of it, just look up my name, Composite Nation, Atlantic, and you'll have it. It's not a long speech. He gives it, the text we have from it is 1869, but he wrote it in 67, 68. Note the dates. What's going on? He's writing it in the midst of the rise of Reconstruction. He first crafts this the year that the 14th Amendment was ratified. 13th Amendment's already in the books. 14th Amendment, equality before law. And my God, the nation just recently had a lesson in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Could you believe it? We thought Section 3 of the 14th was dead forever, and all of a sudden, I was on an amicus brief arguing that, well, they didn't listen to us. God only knows if they were listening today either, but that's another story. But in this speech, Douglass says, America, it's a composite nation. It's a composite nationality. But look at the way he does it. He says, first of all, A nation is a very special creation. It's one of humankind's greatest achievements. Say that in the American Academy today. Now, we love to hate nationalism and nations now. But Douglass believes he was now representing a reinvented nation out of that war and emancipation. He said, the simple organization of a people into a national body, composite or otherwise, is of itself an impressive fact. As an original proceeding, it marks the point of departure of a people from the darkness and chaos of unbridled barbarism to the wholesome restraints of public law and society. Restraints. Well, that's kind of Douglass saying, you want a democracy? It's going to have laws and restraints that you actually believe in. And for the first time in his life, he lived in a republic he believed in. For now. And get this, he gave a definition of what a nation is. And I don't think any social scientist, diplomatic historian, or philosopher has done a heck of a lot better since. A nation, Douglass said, implies a willing surrender and subjection of individual aims and ends, often narrow and selfish, to the broader and better ones that arise out of a society as a whole. It is both a sign and the result of civilization. A nation is a conglomeration of people who have made some agreements to try it together. Oh my goodness, he goes on, he talks about how this is a new American nation now, reinvented out of emancipation, reinvented in the constitutional amendments. Actually, the 15th Amendment is already being 15th on voting rights is already being debated and passed the year he goes and takes this out on the road in '69. He talks about how the United States is now a nascent, youthful country. It's just been reinvented. It's new. It's just beginning its ascent. And then he goes even on to say, this doesn't sound like him anymore. He goes on to say, you know, there are two classes of men. There are the believers and the croakers, he says. You know, he's complaining and bitching and moaning, and nothing's ever what they want it to be. Done that today yet, or 5 times? The believers and the croakers. He quotes Edgar Allan Poe. You know him in Richmond. He quotes Edgar Allan Poe, who you know, in what story was he using? I forget now. Talking about the people who always say never, never, never. You can't do this. You can't do that. You'll never be able to accomplish this. Never, 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 never. Douglass says, never be a Poe. At least the Poe he had chosen to use here. He complains about the gloomy prophets that say this new American Republic it's not going to last. How could it? It's biracial now. And then he even talks for a couple paragraphs about how real democracy can be so threatening, he says. Because it's hard. You got to give up something. Then he talks about how, you know, the reason it's so hard is because we worship power. We don't like to share power. And he says of the United States, circa 1868-69, the Reconstruction United States, he says, it is now our emancipated progressive republic. That America he hated in the 1840s and said so, is now this new thing. But he doesn't stop there. He talks about the past. He says, you know, in the past we were a tangled network of contradictions. It's a nice phrase for saying, I hated that republic. It was destroyed in that massive war. He even goes as far as to say we have defeated our hypocrisy. Now that was a bit too bold. Anybody that claims they're going to defeat human hypocrisy, I don't know, has forgotten about human nature, I guess. But then he says we have weathered the storm. This speech is so hopeful. it's sad when you realize that after 1870, he never gave it again. He talks about how the country has a chance to do something no people have ever done, to create a nation of peoples from all parts of the world, composite nation. This is the classic sort of dream of pluralistic America. And in this middle part of the speech, it reads like a multiculturalism manifesto. It could have come out of the 1990s in any public school system, declaring its devotion to multiculturalism. Or it reads like a mission statement of any university today. Well, a good reason. You know, what are you going to say in a mission statement? Oh, we're not very good at this, but gee, we'll try. We're rather divided now, but maybe we'll get better? No, what's a mission statement? Mission statement's got to make people stand up and sing. And he says, they're coming from everywhere. They being the world. And then, right after that, for the whole middle of the speech, and then down to just the little ending, he takes up Chinese immigration. Controversial subject in the 1860s. It got only more controversial in the 1870s and 1880s. The first Chinese Restriction Act was 1874. It was against Chinese women who supposedly were deemed to be mostly prostitutes. And then the big Chinese Exclusion Act of that era was 1882, which was an attempt at a total Chinese Exclusion Act. Didn't fully work. There will be more Chinese Exclusion Acts into the early 20th century. But Douglass says, come on, America, they're coming. And he goes into this whole long section about how Chinese civilization is 3,000 or 4,000 years old. They've been doing things with books and ideas before there was a glimmer of a thing called America. Yes, their language is alien and foreign, but they'll adapt. Yes, their religions are bewildering to us, but they'll adapt. He's applying an assimilation model. Now, whether that's going to work or not, who knows? But they'll adapt, they'll assimilate. And then he goes in, Douglass is always using nature metaphors. He said, they're going to come through the river valleys, they're coming over the mountains, and he does this in a positive way. They're coming over the hills, they're coming to our cities. They're coming to America. You expect him any moment to turn into Neil Diamond. He says Chinese immigration is, quote, an irrepressible fact. Deal with it. And it does go on. I mean, he has some facts to lay out about how many Chinese are coming and what they can bring with them, the kind of infusion of new cultures that are coming from every direction. And he warns his audiences. He says, you know, they're not going to want to wear your old shoes. They'll probably make their own. And they might make them better. He even makes an argument for how the South needs labor. They will withdraw their eyes from the glowing west and fix upon them the rising sun. They will cross the mountains, cross the plains, descend our rivers, penetrate the heart of the country, and fix their homes with us forever. Deal with it. I put in the deal with it, sorry. Then he says, the reason we can have confidence in this pluralistic, composite America is because of modernity. Douglass did this a lot. He was hardly alone in this. That century had seen, we think we've seen technological, we have, advancements. But look what he had lived through. The steamboat, the telegraph, the railroad, the laying of the cable across the Atlantic, for God's sake. You could send a damn telegram across the Atlantic. How can that be? And he'd lived all the way, well, he hadn't quite yet, but he's going to live all the way to the phonograph where you can record a voice. I mean, good God. electric light bulbs, internal combustion engines eventually. He never had a car. But he says, this will work because the world's becoming modern and it will make it work. It's so hopeful. And he ends up basically saying, race won't matter someday. He says, quote, there are such things in the world as human rights. They rest upon no conventional foundation, but are external, universal, indestructible. That's Douglass's deepest faith of all. Douglass's mind, early and throughout his life, drew on two traditions. One is the Bible. I don't know if you've read my book, but I make a very big deal out of how steeped he was, especially in the Old Testament and in the Hebrew prophets. There's almost no major Douglass speech without often several uses of the Hebrew prophets, especially Jeremiah, Isaiah, Amos, Ezekiel, especially Isaiah. And the other tradition he drew off was the Enlightenment and the tradition of natural rights, this idea that certain liberties and rights are inherent in us. Everybody has them. They're like, he once compared natural rights to precious ore from the ground. You have to extract it, and you have to hold on to it, and you have to make it into something. But it's there. And he ends this remarkable speech on a kind of peroration about the natural rights tradition. And that's why people want to come to this country. Not because of the original Constitution, but because of the new one, born of emancipation. Let's say a couple other things about that, and then Rob and I are going to have a conversation up here. And then you're going to tell us what I did wrong. But just a couple other thoughts. This idea of a composite nation is not his original idea. It's been laying around in American culture for a very long time. But the reason he can be so hopeful at this moment has everything to do with the transformations, bloody and horrific as they were, of the war and its aftermath that this museum represents, interprets. Douglass saw the American Civil War as a kind of biblical Armageddon. He saw it through the traditions of millennialism and apocalypticism, this idea that there are some manifest events in history, perhaps guided by God, perhaps guided by other forces, that tear up existing regimes and situations and conditions and make new ones. Now that's easy, isn't it, to say as some sort of explanation for the level of bloodletting in the Civil War. Tell that to a widow. Tell that to a mother who lost 3 sons. Oh, this is all in the service of the reinvention of the idea of republicanism. Really? But that's actually what Douglass believed. So did Lincoln. Partly because they had to. They had to find some way to justify that scale of blood. It doesn't necessarily mean they were right, but it was their explanation. And Douglass believed by 67, 68, 69, and 70, he was living in the reinvented United States, redefined in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the first Civil Rights Act ever passed by the U.S. Congress, and in the Reconstruction Acts, which set up black voting rights in the South, among other things. And he, even for a short while, became what we today might call a soft imperialist. He thought the United States now should take this new republic and its new ideology to the Caribbean, to South America, to places that didn't have republics and voting rights and liberty and human rights and democracies. He advocated annexation of Santo Domingo. And Grant appointed him, he was like a secretary to the commission that went to Santo Domingo. And he went. And later on, he's going to become U.S. ambassador to Haiti in the late 1880s. Actually, he got caught there trying to enforce a policy he didn't believe in, but that's another story. But that's how optimistic, for a short while, emancipation made. I may have said this already, but I can't find, after 1870, maybe 71, he still gave this in 1870, but after 1871, I can't find anywhere where he still gave this. When Reconstruction began to be defeated, began to erode or fail, speech didn't fit anymore. Especially after 72 and 74, when the Democratic Party took back control of Congress. That doesn't mean Douglass lost hope in America. He didn't. He never completely lost hope, despite redemption, the Ku Klux Klan, the outburst of lynching by the 1890s. That's the last great speech of Douglass's life. It's called Lessons of the Hour. It's all about lynching. But he never completely lost hope that there'd been a reinvented American republic that someday might still be retrieved, even if it was being crushed again. And he is one of those rare people who, not just because of his origins as a slave, but he's one of those rare reformers who, undergoes years of being a radical outsider as an abolitionist, but becomes eventually a kind of political insider within, to a degree, the Republican Party of the 1870s and 1880s. That's a rare trajectory in the lives of radical reformers. They don't often get to see all shapes of that trajectory. I'll just leave you with this. Back in 1855, midst of the crisis, and I know you new exhibit here called Impending Crisis, the coming of the Civil War. He was living the coming of the Civil War. Didn't know that yet, of course, nobody knew that. But he publishes his second autobiography in 1855. It's his long-form masterpiece. It's 440 pages instead of the 120 that his first narrative. There's a reason everybody reads that first narrative. It's only 120 pages. The second one's 440. It's his long-form masterpiece. He's 10 years older. He's 37 years old. He's a political abolitionist now. He's a political animal now. He's beginning to embrace possible uses of violence. He lands that baby right in the midst of the crisis over the expansion of slavery into the West. And it sold well. Sold 18,000 copies the first year. That's good today. The last line of that book, and you can feel it on the page. He's trying to figure out, how am I going to end this? How do I end this story of my life? And it ends with a passage where he says, as long as heaven allows me to do this work, the work of an abolitionist, I will do it with my pen, my voice, and my vote. Pen, my voice, and my vote. Now, the pen and the voice is all he ever had. He never made a dollar between 1841 and 1877, when he got his first federal job, any other way than with his pen and his voice, which is why he had a hard time feeding his family at the time. But that he added that vote, because in New York State he could vote, because he owned enough property as a black man to be able to vote. Most blacks could not. So when you're struggling, you're wondering about the future, and you're living in an election year, whenever that might happen, Just remember that line. His pen, his voice, and his vote. It's all any of us have. I mean, some have more wealth than others, and they can use it for good ends. But it's about all we have, and most of us don't have a pen. I mean, we don't all write op-eds. We did. Well, we don't have enough newspapers now for those of us who do write them, because they're dying. His voice, his pen, and his vote. Those are two very different Douglasses, and now Rob and I will have a chat about that. How could that be the same person who hated his country, and then didn't, and then kind of stopped saying that he didn't?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that, Professor Blight. That was tremendous. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions from the floor, so I'll ask a couple of maybe warm-up questions. So we finished there with the sort of the paradox of Douglass loving and hating his country. So perhaps you could clarify for us a little, Professor Blight, as to the how and why Douglass does go from ferocious critic of the slave-holding American Republic of the 1850s, and then to one of the most active of its defenders in 1868, 70.
It does deserve a little more context. First of all, in the 1840s, where I was quoting a couple of times from, he's a very young abolitionist. If you've learned anything, if you've read about abolitionism, they had a variety of tactics and strategies and arguments. And of course, one of the arguments was against American hypocrisy. How can you be this republic that claims it's a democracy and yet have the largest slave system in the world except for Russia? What's with the hypocrisy? It was a favorite subject. In fact, for Douglass, his favorite and his most sought after speech in the early years when he's out on the circuit, 42, 43, 44, was the speech that came to be known as the slaveholder's sermon. And that's where he would attack the clergy. Christian hypocrisy. How can you be this God-fearing Christian nation? Born in Christian cosmology, born in the dream that you were a Christian nation, and yet do this to a huge swath of people. And Douglass was a great mimic. And even when he was so young, especially when he was so young, he was a performer. And often when he would do his slaveholder's sermon speech, he would break into his favorite Southern accent, and he would prance around the stage and perform as a Southern preacher. Slaves, be loyal to your masters. And he would quote passages in the Bible that seemed to be pro-slavery. And he would use passages about the natural inferiority of the Negro, on he'd go. And audiences loved it. They fell out on the floor laughing. And there were times when he would be at an abolition meeting, and again, this is what I meant by him processing this in irony. Bitter irony sometimes. But they'd be having some resolution, and every speaker's supposed to speak to that resolution. He'd start speaking to the resolution, and somebody in the audience would say, "Hey, Fred, do the sermon." And he'd say, "Oh, well, not tonight." "No, Fred, do the sermon." And he'd break into his mimicking of the Southern preacher, and there went that resolution. The point is, he could use wit, irony, contradiction, his own bitterness, bordering on hatred, to make this argument that the United States is not what it says it is. It can never be what it says it is as long as it has slavery. And slavery is growing in leaps and bounds. It's growing like crazy across out into the Southwest. The war has everything to do. And I hate to be so simplistic about it. And by the way, I used the word rage, and I said that use the word hatred at times. I have a chapter in my biography, whether you read it or not, there is a chapter that, on Douglass as a war propagandist. Because once the war broke out, and it was in its second half of 1861, he became the most vicious, thumping war propagandist you might ever want to read. He invented the slaveholder as the horrible Hun. I mean, he didn't use horrible Hun, but it's the same equivalent, who must be killed and destroyed. He advocated the death of slaveholders. It was ugly, bitter, bloody rhetoric, which war produces, civil wars in particular. And he did this throughout 61 and 60. He did it throughout the war, really, but especially those first 2 years of the war, because the war is not yet a war against slavery. And he's basically trying to create the hated enemy, which happens in all wars, doesn't it? I mean, look at the kind of war propaganda the United States produced in the Second World War. I did a term paper once, undergraduate or I can't even remember now, on the Office of War Information during the Second World War, which was the U.S. war propaganda agency. They employed like hundreds of people writing war propaganda, all about morale. So Douglass was unloading that rage. But he did not know where the war was going any more than anybody else. He had no access to inside the Lincoln administration or inside the Republican Party. But as the war finally became a war for emancipation against the odds, by 1864 and 65, he became one of Lincoln's greatest fans. He was one of Lincoln's most ferocious critics in 61 and 62. And then once the war is won, times are not easy in 65 and 60. In fact, he didn't know what he was going to do with the rest of his life. There's this beautiful passage in his last autobiography where he's remembering back to the end of the Civil War, 1865 and 66, and he was a huge Shakespeare fan. The Bible, Shakespeare, a few Enlightenment thinkers were Douglass's friends. And he said, I feel like Othello's occupation is gone, which is that famous line in Othello. When Othello is without his army anymore, he's lost his steeds, he's lost his generals, and he doesn't know yet, but he's soon to lose his wife, or thought he lost his wife to Iago, and he's going to kill his wife. It's a horrible tragedy, you know. But Othello's occupation is gone. It's like, what am I going to do now? Slavery's over, they don't need me anymore. It turns out it was much sought after as a voice, as a speaker, et cetera, et cetera. But Reconstruction inspired him. By the way, he didn't like the 14th Amendment. He wanted it to go further. 14th Amendment has limitations in it. He wanted it to be more radical. He didn't like the 15th Amendment. He wanted the 15th Amendment, voting rights, to outlaw, tests. And it didn't. It was the most, conservative, compromised version of the Voting Rights Amendment. He didn't like either one of them, but he said, that's the best we can get. And he went to parades to celebrate. But he saw somehow that this new country, and for him it was totally new, the old America, and there's so many places in his writing where he says, it's the old America, the one that had lasted 80-some years, 407, according to Lincoln at Gettysburg, that had been killed. It was gone. It was dead in the blood of the Civil War. Now, it had to be reinvented. And he's only in his 40s at the time of the war. He's going to live 30 more years. He doesn't know that. But he's going to live 30 more years to 1895 to see it almost all fall apart again. But that transit from the loathing of his country and fearing he would never have a place in it, to that moment of the Composite Nation speech, You know, I've tried this once. I've done seminars just on the life and writings of Douglass, and I actually asked students. Of course, they know where I'm going with it. They're far too clever, and I just have them read passages cold and read these from the 1840s and this from this. I said, does this seem like the same person? They say, yeah, we knew you were going to do that because you wrote something on that, and you know, probably assigned it and forgot. But anyway, but it's an interesting manifestation of how the Civil War caused tremendous transformation, even as many of them didn't last very long.
I have other questions, but I might throw it open to the audience. Who's got some questions in the audience? Yes.
So with Douglas's trip to the UK, especially being so long, and then UK abolitionists buying his freedom eventually.
Right.
I just can't, especially when you read in the book, he almost stays there.
He flirted with staying, yeah.
I just think of also James Baldwin going to France.
Right.
But
Turkey.
but being kind of finding that Americanism in a foreign country.
Yeah, well, a lot of you have been abroad in whatever walk of life you're in. Sometimes you can find out how American you are by going abroad because people start asking you to be a spokesman for your country. I didn't come here to do that. Well, then why are you teaching? You know. But England, he's still very young then, as you know. It's 1845, 47. He's still in his 20s. And he's not completely formed as a thinker. He's still very much a devotee of William Lloyd Garrison. He's a Garrisonian. He toes the line. Although Garrison had enormous influence and inspiration. And he loved Garrison until they had a falling out. But in England, for the first time in his life, he didn't have to look over his shoulder. He didn't have to worry someone's going to shout a racist epithet at him anywhere he goes. Someone's going to throw fruit and bricks at him. He gives a speech. Instead, he had the opposite. He gets embraced by a well-developed, first Irish, then Scottish, and then British, and they really were different. But anti-slavery movements, which go back to the 18th century. At one point, I have this in the book, he gets to meet Thomas Clarkson, one of the great founders of the British anti-slavery movement. Clarkson was like within 6 months of dying. This was 1846. And Douglass is taken to meet the great Thomas Clarkson. And he says, I felt like I was shaking hands with the 18th century. He's inspired. In Scotland, he arrives during one of the typical Scottish ecclesiastical wars. They're fighting like hell over what the Scottish church should do here and do there. It turns out the Church of Scotland had raised a whole lot of money in the American South among slaveholders. And there was this big movement afoot called Send Back the Money. And Douglass arrives right in the midst of this. Was perfect for him. You want religious hypocrisy? I'm good at that. Just tell me where to go speak. And they loved it. And then in Britain, he spends in Britain proper a full year. And there's a scholar in England who you can find the website. I could give it to you. Actually, I cite it in my book. She tried to locate every single venue all over the British Isles in which he spoke. I mean, it's half a zillion. No, I think she stopped at, 180 places. This is Ireland, Scotland, and England, all over the country. He spoke to huge audiences, mostly adoring audiences. But he also got very lonely. His wife and children, of course, back in the States. They have 4 children already. He left 2 of them essentially as babies. They barely knew him when he did return. He makes lifetime friendships when he's in. He also makes he also meets some people who want to control him, doesn't like that, especially a couple Irish. But he, you know, it's a youthful flowering for him. He finds his voice. And when he comes back, he's no longer quite willing to be a follower of much of anything. He wants independence. Now that's easy to say, not easy to do. It's an extremely important transition in his life. I always try to point to like 3 or 4 huge transitions in Douglass's life. The first is escaping slavery. The second is the tour of the British Isles. And some of those lifetime friendships will be with him forever. And yes, a group of Brits bought his freedom. So that when he came back, he had his free papers. And he wouldn't budge out of England until he got the actual papers from Thomas Hall. His literal free papers. And that's where he met Julia Griffiths, who became a very important person in his life. He moved to America and lived with the Douglasses for 6 years. And became, in fact, the assistant editor on his newspaper and his chief fundraiser. He met people in England who made his life possible. And complicated. So, yeah, that's, you can't overestimate how important that period was. Okay.
You said that Douglass made the statement that he believed at some point race would not matter.
Well, he implies that.
Implies that. Is that
the country and
because-
its composite nature would one day just overcome it.
Is that because when he was in England, he saw interracial marriages that were accepted, or what? So
Well,
what-
he knew that by 68, 69, when he's doing that composite nation, he had known enough people, white people, Brits or Americans, who had advanced beyond their racism. Dear friends who had helped him make his life. Not a huge list, but important. He knew that racism was possible to conquer on an individual basis. How you do it on a societal basis is what we're still trying to do. But he saw in this multi-ethnic pluralism that he believed was already America. And by the way, he had his blind spots. It's in the book too, if you look. He didn't always have kind things to say about Native Americans. He wasn't sure they were assimilable. But Asians, Africans, all those different kinds of Europeans, with all those languages, bring them to America. Our laws, our new constitution, our system has the possibility of a pluralistic democracy. Now, I'm not saying that because, gee whiz, I wish we could do it. I mean, gee whiz, I wish we could. But that's where his mind was in the late 18th. Now, he was no fool either. I mean, he would in the next breath tell you that beware, 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 the slaveholders are still there. Their ideology is still there. The slave power as an ideology is still there. But he believed the Reconstruction laws and the constitutional amendments, and at least the Republican Party he knew at that moment. But as you know, you learned your Reconstruction, that Republican Party is going to change very swiftly in the 1870s. Its leadership begins to die off. Thaddeus Stevens dies, Sumner dies, etc. But he knew some of these politicians who wrote that 14th Amendment. He knew they believed it, which is something we tried to say in our amicus brief about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. They actually believed this. Equality before law. Try it on, Supreme Court.
We have time for one more question. There is one out here. Yes, sir, that was very swift.
I'll try to give swift answers. Maybe we can get a second one.
Do you think Douglass's children's economic struggles contributed to his change of heart following the early 1870s?
Yes. Everything's related. No single causes for anything. You know that by being a historian or a reader of history. His adult children struggled. Lewis, the oldest, did all right, but the rest of them not so much. And they had lots of children, 21 grandchildren. for the Douglas. And a lot of them died in childhood, about almost half. But yeah, he was extremely, we know quite a bit about that from letters. He never wrote about it in the autobiography. He almost never wrote about his children at all, publicly, except to be proud of the two who served in the Union Army. He really worried about them. And by the way, he ended up paying the tuition. He wasn't as rich as some people thought he was by the 1880s and 1890s by any means. He got hundreds and hundreds of begging letters from blacks. They would address him as the Great Douglas. I need $25 to go to school. Sometimes he would send it, but with his granddaughters, and his daughter Rosetta had 6 daughters. He puts them through school. He put his grandson, who was the incredible talented violinist, through the New England Conservatory. His own children did not do so well. Their children, he tried to get them an education, the education he never had. Anyway, yes, that is a subtext, the struggles of his extended family. And even how they dealt with his second marriage, which was not easily, putting it mildly, was a subtext to everything about his life. Especially by the 1880s, when Douglass is living in Washington, he woke up every day wondering about what sort of tabloid scandal story would appear in today's paper. Because there were 4 or 5 black newspapers in Washington, and 2 of them were basically scandal sheets. And one of their favorite subjects was the struggles of the Douglasses. So-and-so lost a job. So-and-so might be getting a divorce. Mr. Douglas was seen here doing that. I mean, no wonder he went on the road all the time to give lectures in Iowa or anywhere, to get out of town. And he would write letters to Rosetta, his daughter. The best letters to his children went to the daughter. I mean, she's the oldest. They adored each other. She made a miserable marriage. One time it's really late in life. It's like 1893. He's out in the Midwest giving the lessons of the hour speech on lynching. He's tired. He's got palsy in his hands, which is the beginning of heart disease probably. He's just worn out, and he says, "Have you picked the apples? I want some applesauce. Can you please put up some good applesauce when I get home?" When you read those, for every one of those I have access to, there had to be 50 more. Have you picked peaches? They had an orchard at Cedar Hill, 2 orchards. He was always wanting somehow to just sit by a fireplace, eat applesauce, and read. But he was out on the circuit, trying to change the world and make some money. Because he's paying for everybody. The entire extended family was dependent. Anyway.
We're going to wrap it up here. Professor Blight is going to be signing books afterwards, so if you still have a question, buy a book and ask it. Let me say thank you very much.